In this comparative study, I'll explore how directors employ realist film theory to epitomize the cultural prevalence of identity loss amongst the youth through 2 films. A Brighter Summer Day, a 1991 film directed by Yang Dechang or Edward Yang, and La Haine, a 1995 film directed by Matthew Kassovitz. The comparison is particularly intriguing because of the 2 films' contrasting origins and approaches to realism, namely neorealism and poetic realism, respectively. And the perspective of realist film theory reveals how directors creatively convey social criticism. After all, as Edward Hudlin comments in his essay, Understanding the Realist Tendency in the Cinema, the uniqueness of the film medium is established by realism's ability to magically preserve the ephemeral, transient, fleeting impressions of material life. Indeed, neorealism and poetic realism are, fundamentally, mirrors of their societies. Though both began as film movements, their legacy and influence has transformed them into approaches to realism, if not film theories themselves. Their defining distinction is that, where neorealism aims to create documentary verisimilitude, poetic realism presents a recreated reality. In other words, where neorealism is literal, poetic realism is symbolic. Consequently, A Brighter Summer Day and La Haine are deeply entrenched in the histories they depict, and it will be impossible to compare them without examining their contexts. A Brighter Summer Day spotlights Taipei, Taiwan in the early 1960s, a politically and socially confusing period under the martial law of the Kuomintang. Consequently, the population was categorized into 2 factions, Benshengren, Taiwanese natives, and Waishengren, Chinese mainlanders who arrived in Taiwan with the KMT. However, the line becomes unclear for the youth. Who are they, exactly? In search of an identity, the new generation compensated their unfulfilled desire for community and sense of belonging via joining street gangs, becoming an honest reflection of the Taiwanese society at the time. La Haine, on the other hand, firmly establishes itself within the 1990s French banlieue, a space of police brutality, immigrant protest, and general civil unrest. The impoverished immigrant youths inhabiting the banlieue were simultaneously targeted and ignored. They were aggressively stereotyped by the police, government, and media, yet their voices were deliberately suppressed, portrayed as violent gangs threatening the safety of the modernized cities. The youths subsequently are stuck in the banlieue, at a loss of who they are, what they represent, and how their future will look. In both films, the feeling of loss experienced by the youths is largely a byproduct of the society and government ignoring their need for an identity, and how the directors acknowledge the social phenomenon reveals their diverging approaches to realism. For Yang, borrowing influence from Italian neorealism, he provides context via the opening text plates, which strengthens an image of historicity and objectivity, positioning the film as a cinematographic account of Sir's fall as a result of his identity crisis. Contrastingly, Kassovitz, approaching the context from the perspective of poetic realism, reveals his criticism through the ending dolly and voiceover. The audience perceives immense irony as Hubert, the mediator for Vince's violent tendencies, pulls Vince's gun on the police, where the ambiguity of the final gunshot represents the cycle of violence beneath the banlieue youth's identity loss in a purely figural and symbolic manner. In a way, despite their realist nature, both films address their characters' struggles via traditionally formalist techniques. And perhaps the best example of this phenomenon is their approach to structure. Literary critic Zietan Todorov, in his essay Structural Analysis of Narrative, points out a general pattern that describes traditional narrative arcs. The minimal complete plot can be seen as the shift from one equilibrium to another, separated by a period of imbalance. Applied to the diegesis, one can claim that A Brighter Summer Day and La Haine are both, to a certain extent, plotless. Rather than spotlighting the cause and effect of the characters' actions, the 2 films focus on painting portraits. The directors prioritize characters and their social representations, a defining feature of realism. Subsequently, to the audience, the characters' actions seem to lack consequences, where the 2 films instead create tension via the passage of time, and how they do so represent their diverging approaches of neorealism and poetic realism. On one hand, for A Brighter Summer Day, the equilibrium never shifts in the first place. Perhaps the best description of Yang's narrative technique is Slices of Life, where he presents the youth's actions and conflicts via mise-en-scène editing. Yang orders the progression of events as an interweaving narrative, where he constantly cuts back and forth between various character perspectives and locations. To illustrate, he cuts from the cheering crowd in the concert auditorium to the murder scene of Honey, where the juxtaposition of visual brightness and auditory volume augments the desolate atmosphere of Honey's death, ensconcing a uniquely neorealist objective camera. Indeed, throughout the film, during scene cuts, by prolonging the last shot of the previous scene and the first shot of the next scene, Yang crafts a sense of continuation that the scenes perpetuate even after the camera cuts away, emphasizing the passage of time. He even preserves continuity by returning to the same scenes tens of minutes later in real-world runtime, yet only seconds later narratively, establishing the film's parallel nature. In the words words of film critic Tony Rayns,
he has constructed increasingly intricate plots and inviting the audience to build up a composite picture which offers us some sense of what Taiwan is and has been.
The audience experience a sense of sonder, that the youth characters' struggles of identity are just as complex as our own experiences, heightening the verisimilitude of the subjects. Even though we witness Sir's fall, the equilibrium does not change, because every character has equal importance. A Brighter Summer Day is, ultimately, a film about the Taiwanese youths as a collective. In the words of Ming,
这个世界是不会变的。
On the other hand, though the end constantly progresses towards breaking the equilibrium, it never reaches a new one. The structural approach of the film is a lot more symbolic, being divided into two juxtaposed halves, the banlieue and the city. Filming the banlieue, Kassovitz employs wide-angle lenses with compositions of clear geometric balance while injecting rich and diverse diegetic sound design, instilling a sense of equilibrium and order. Conversely, filming the city, Kassovitz uses telephoto lenses which enlarge and blur the background while only including snippets of music and voices, isolating the characters visually and audibly. In the first half, the audience experienced a sense of intimacy and unity of the banlieue, a place where the trio, coming from backgrounds marginalized in the French society, Jewish, Black, and Arab, considers as their identity. In the second half, the physical and auditory distance of the camera symbolizes the disorientation of the trio as they navigate the unfamiliar Paris. Thus, in between the halves, Kassovitz employs the dolly zoom as the audience watches the modernized Paris disappear, presenting the ultimate dilemma of the film. Youth, disenfranchised by living among hardship and hatred, are unable to assimilate properly into Parisian society, stuck only at home in the very environments that are destroying them. Consequently, the non-sequitur events in the film create tension from their isolated mundanity, where Kassovitz reminds the audience of the passage of time through the timestamps, resembling a ticking time bomb from its sound design. The film progresses towards the disappearance of equilibrium and order, and just as the audience expects for the film to explode, it does, but in a completely unexpected way, metaphoric of the lives of the banlieue youth, chaos, uncertainty, and violence. In A Brighter Summer Day, Yang consistently photographs youth violence via removed and emotionless long shots, where the camera is positioned slightly above the eyeline with a roughly 35 to 50mm lens, imitating human vision. The lighting, too, remains strictly naturalistic, characteristic of neorealism, where large, cold-temperature artificial key lights accentuate the harshness of moonlight, paralleling the camera's objectivity. Yang's depiction of violence possesses an uncanny aura, positioning the audience as adults spectating the drama with utter nonchalance. Moreover, the youths are in the shadows with low-key lighting, with their small size minimizes their visual importance, symbolizing their loneliness and loss as they attempt to find community through the perceived brotherhood of street gangs. Doing so, Yang presents the youth as self-contained groups, inhabiting their world without the interference of the camera as they search for their identity through violence. After all, gangs are the direct path for them to be associated with the natives or mainlanders that define their parents. Thus, regardless of how horrific their actions are, the audience cannot help but retain a sense of sympathy and despair. In direct contrast to A Brighter Summer Day, Kassovitz photographs youth violence in La Haine from an intimate and emotional approach. Especially for the first half, Kassovitz immerses the audience in a community of banlieue youths through the proximity of the camera and the characters. However, where La Haine's depiction of violence becomes interesting is when Kassovitz deviates from traditionally realist techniques, namely when Vince gets the opportunity to shoot a racist skinhead. When Hubert, breaking his usual acts, encourages Vince to pull the trigger, Kassovitz employs dramatic close-ups to expose Vince's tough guy persona, along with presenting the latter's perspective via a point-of-view-like shot as he unmasks Vince's facade of masculinity. Thus, as Vince breaks down, the camera cuts to a wide shot, a rarity for the second half of the film, as if out of relief. The trio appears extra small, even insignificant, in the dark alleyway, symbolizing their vulnerability and disorientation. The juxtaposition between the traditionally formalist and realist techniques parallels Vince's struggle with his own identity, where Kassovitz constructs his poetically realist style through a self-aware, character-centric approach to filmmaking. Just like with A Brighter Summer Day, the audience is consequently left sympathetic. Beyond sympathy, both films exhibit a consistent sense of loneliness and isolation for the youths, where their actions are portrayed as mere products of the fundamentally flawed society. Even though their cinematographic approaches are diametric opposites of each other, they bear a striking parallelism: the authentic camera. The images they capture are an accurate microcosm of the youth, an impression, which is perhaps the core aim of realism. A Brighter Summer Day and La Haine are two films with completely different backgrounds, geographically and temporally. Yet, they share the universal theme of the identity struggles of disadvantaged youths. And with a topic so entrenched in the context and history, the film's divergent approaches, neorealism and poetic realism, reveal how similar social criticisms can emerge in contrasting creative decisions of the director, even within realist film theory. After all, it is films that speak the voice of the everyday person which resonates with us the most.